All right, so we're going to do a solo cast, solo video for the first time as well on simple solutions to complex problems. This is something talked about multiple times on the Legion Strength and Conditioning podcast, more focused on fitness. And I actually thought that this was something that was worth pulling out of that fitness only scenario and applying to broader context as well. Although we will actually talk about fitness a bunch today, since that's something that I feel confident enough to, make more declarative statements about. But on the Legion podcast, we often try to discredit bad ideas in the fitness space and the CrossFit space, of which there are plenty, rest assured. And one of the things that we often end up discussing is the idea of simple solutions to complex problems. And I wanted to try to pull that out and elaborate on that a little bit, because I think it's very relevant for anyone doing anything somewhat difficult in an uncertain area with lots of different factors that can actually dictate an outcome. So when we talk about simple solutions to complex problems, I actually think there's a better way to frame that comes from more of like a business strategy mindset. And it's something that's called the Kinema Framework. And I think there was a relatively well-known Harvard Business Review article about this. I should actually probably look that up before starting to record, but that's okay. I'll link to it in the show notes, link to maybe some YouTube videos and articles explaining it. But the idea is that there's different types of decision-making environments with different amounts of uncertainty, and also the actual outcomes are coupled more or less tightly to essentially like following an established solution or a best practice, right? And so in the Kinema Framework, there's 4 different types of decision-making environments, right? One is like a simple environment with an obvious solution. One is a complicated environment where there's like an established best practice expertise type of scenario that can be like pretty messy and difficult to actually figure out, but there are established ways of doing things. One is a complex environment where that's when you start to actually deal with emergent phenomena, results that are uncoupled from the actual intentions of the intervention, unintended consequences, right? And then there's chaotic scenarios in which that coupling is even further pulled apart, and things are very, very uncertain and constantly changing, right? And so when we're talking about most things that people actually care about in the world, so in the case of fitness, right, developing an athlete, writing training programs; in the case of business, finding product market fit for a new offering, entering into a marketplace, recovering a small business from a global pandemic, a lot of these things end up being in this complex sphere of the Kinema Framework, whereas a lot of people think of the way that solutions should be created as being in either the complicated sphere or the simple sphere, right? And so when most people are thinking about coming up with a solution to a problem, they think there's potentially some sort of established best practice that needs to be followed, right? So if we think about fitness and you go on Reddit and you say, hey, listen, like I'd like to get stronger, what should I do? There's going to be a bunch of people just laying out established programs that do work reasonably well. And in some cases, especially for beginners, there is like an established thing that works pretty well almost all the time. And if you just sort of follow it, you're going to get decent results. When you actually start to get into more advanced levels, then people think of like things as being complicated. Okay, I need to find an expert who has a proven track record, who has a system that they follow that they can then implement for me, and I will get results. And so this is where a lot of fitness communication sort of falls, right? When people are putting stuff out there, when people are putting stuff out there for clients, to attract clients, discussing on podcasts, whatever, it's like, oh, here's this method, right? It's the 5-3-1 method. Get into this with diets as well, right? This is the ketogenic diet. This is the paleo diet. Here's the plan. It's complicated. There's, these very specific hormonal pathways that we're targeting. There's this enzyme over here, which then does this specific reaction. We want to upregulate that. We don't want too much of this. It's all very confusing, but there is a flow chart somewhere. And if you just follow this, you're going to have great results, right? And so this is very, very appealing to people. People like thinking about things this way, and it resonates with them, right? That they sort of have this idea of like, okay, there is a way to do this out there. I've seen people get results. And if I just have someone tell me the secret plan that these other people follow, then I too will be the one who gets results, right? I too will be the one who can follow this specific plan, who can upregulate this enzyme, who can downregulate that pathway, who can, increase insulin sensitivity, who can increase thyroid hormone sensitivity, who can increase testosterone, who can increase muscle protein synthesis, right? Like all these little pieces. We just got to do the exact right thing, turn all the knobs exactly correctly. We're going to get results. It's going to be as simple as that. But the reality is that things don't actually work that way. But it's tough to actually parse that out, right? Because if you are someone who's coaching a lot of people, what you end up thinking is you see the people who get results, right? There's the people who do what you say, they have fantastic results, and you're like, awesome, these people follow the plan works. The only issue is the psychology of people who are not following the plan. If they could just listen up and follow through, then they too would get results. They're not doing it, that's on them. I'm a great coach, I have my system, it's all laid out. It's all on these people for not being able to actually execute. But in reality, right, it's not just the complex environment of the psychology of behavior change, of motivation, all that stuff, but it's also much messier than people like to think when they lay out these very specific plans with, these diagrams of how different enzymes are getting moved around and all that kind of stuff, right? So especially when we're actually dealing with athletes who are at a somewhat higher level, we're starting to move from the realm of the complicated to the complex, right? And so once we move into complex systems in the Kinema Framework, what we're actually starting to deal with is areas where there is not an established way of getting something done. Sometimes things have unintended consequences. Sometimes you're dealing with emergent phenomena, meaning things that are more than the sum of their parts, right? So you think about like a school of fish, right? Like swarming birds, all that kind of stuff. Those are sort of emergent phenomena built out of simple rules from organisms that aren't necessarily aware of the larger whole that they're creating, but these simple rules can create a much different, larger phenomena than the specific thing that you're looking at. So anytime you're dealing with a complex biological system, you have to be aware of unintended consequences. You have to be aware of things like threshold effects, where you can start to stack different effects and nothing happens, and all of a sudden you can have significant breakthroughs into either good or bad results, right? The sort of colloquialism about stuff like that is, you build a bridge, but you can't cross it until you put the last slat down. You strike the stone 1,000 times, but it's the 1,001st that actually cracks it. So a lot of biological systems have effects like that. They also have things where, most people are aware of various hormone resistance types of scenarios where you start injecting yourself with testosterone, you downregulate the body's natural ability to produce testosterone. You can potentially create some scenarios in which cells are resistant to, androgen hormones. So you're actually having a harder time getting the results because even though there's blood levels there, the receptors aren't necessarily picking up on those things. So there's all these just like messy, complicated, complex feedback loops in biological systems that make it very, very difficult to have targeted interventions that you sort of like know exactly what's going to happen with, right? And so when you're talking about coaching people, when you're talking about trying to create some sort of intervention through training for people who are relatively new, like I said before, you can say, listen, this is what's going to happen. If you follow this program, you're going to get this result, and you're probably going to be right a lot of the time. But once people kind of get past that initial stage of learning what they're doing, of kind of accumulating just like general learning and training results, you have to start to think about things in this more complex way where you don't necessarily know exactly what's going to happen. You can try to create an intervention that may or may not actually get the result that you want. And you have to start to kind of test stuff out, right? You put stuff out there and you see what happens. So say you have an athlete, you think they potentially need to get stronger to improve in their sport, right? If we're talking about athletes who I coach, a lot of these folks are competing in CrossFit. So you say, you know what, listen, you're pretty good at this. You're not quite as strong as we'd like you to be relative to some of your competitors. So let's do a training cycle that actually focuses on strength. We'll do some squatting, we'll do some deadlifting, we'll do some weighted pull-ups, we'll do some bench press. It's going to be awesome. So number one, is that the correct intervention to even try, right? Should we be trying to get this person to become stronger? Yes or no? I don't actually know, right? It's not always clear that getting stronger is going to make someone better at their sport in the case of CrossFit. Number two, say someone does need to get stronger. Is this training program actually going to result in them becoming stronger? I also don't know that. But what I can do is I can make a guess and I can try to create these scenarios to get the result that I want, see if they work. Did I get the result that I wanted? Did this athlete get stronger? Yes or no? If yes, did they also get better at their sport? Yes or no, right? So now we're in this situation where we're making decisions under more uncertainty. So we need to be a little bit more humble about the types of outcomes that we predict, as well as what those are going to mean for someone's actual results in the sport, right? So we're talking about these complex systems where we're trying to intervene in. This is where this epistemic humility comes in, where it's not just a matter of follow my system. The good athletes follow it correctly, they have great results. Everyone else just screwed it up, they didn't do it right. It's like, hey, listen, we're making decisions under uncertainty. These are the types of things that we think might actually create results for you. Maybe they won't. Maybe they won't work at all. Maybe you will do the same thing for 6 months and nothing will happen. You'll get worse. Then on month 7, you'll suddenly get better, right? We see this kind of stuff happen all of the time. And the reality is that it's because we're dealing with complex biological systems with competing effects, with unintended consequences, with all sorts of messy stuff happening that we don't have control over. So this is the case where, again, the epistemic humility is beneficial as a coach actually working with someone to try to get them better. The problem is, though, is that this type of like wishy-washy, oh, like maybe it works, maybe it doesn't work. Who knows? We can bench press, but maybe your bench press won't even go up. We can get you stronger, but maybe you'll still suck at rowing and double unders. Like, I don't know what's happening. That's not a particularly attractive message to clients, right? To potential clients, to potential members, to potential people who want to actually get better at the sport of CrossFit, to be sort of like, oh, like, I just actually don't know what's going to work. So I recently read a book by Julia Galef called The Scout Mindset, which, I liked a lot, which is sort of like a mood affiliation type of thing where I'm like, yeah, involved in this rationalist community. I've followed Julia's podcast for a long time. I've read, some of the blogs that she wrote in the past, and I love this stuff. I love thinking about epistemic humility. I love thinking about decision making under uncertainty. I love thinking about making better predictions and projections, a la Philip Tetlock. But the reality is for a lot of people, like they're not super invested in this stuff. Julia makes a very compelling case that adopting a scout mindset, right, trying to figure out what's actually going on, is beneficial for people in a lot of areas. And I'm pretty convinced by this as someone who makes an effort to adopt a scout mindset myself and, just talks about how no one can know anything and you just have to make your best guess, even when it's something that people want to hear more certainty on. I'm pretty bought in by this argument. I do think that one of the areas that she sort of focuses on is this idea of people wanting someone who's more certain as a leader. She does a pretty good job of dispelling this myth, especially in like difficult business scenarios where a lot of folks may think that you want, a super certain leader who's going to guide you into battle and knows exactly what needs to happen and shows no shame, no humility, never backs down. And yeah, sure, there may be something to that, but Julia does a great job of saying that, like, actually a lot of the people who we look to as famous, successful, important business leaders are very clear on what they're certain about and what they're uncertain about. And a lot of what they're doing is thinking in bets, right? That they're thinking, this has a 15% chance of paying off. The payoff is extremely high. The downside risk is capped. This is something that we should move into. And if it doesn't work, fine. If it does work and we stack enough of these bets that do work, we're in a different stratosphere as far as our business goes, right? And so I think that her case there is extremely compelling. Where I do think it potentially breaks down, though, sort of like I was saying before, is in this context of marketing, right? So it's not necessarily appropriate as a leader or as a coach of an individual to behave in this like very certain, no humility, I'm not going to even doubt that I'm wrong type of way, right? That you're trying to get control over the situation. You're trying to show that you know exactly what you're doing all the time. But when you are trying to communicate to people who are already thinking of things in sort of a simple way or this complicated way where it's like, hey, listen, I'm just on the search for the right way to do this thing. And you have this explanation of how things work that sounds complicated to me, but maybe somewhat counterintuitive and right, that's actually an extremely effective way to get people to buy into what you're doing. So I think that we see this all the time in the fitness space in a way that, just kind of perverts the information out there, because content creators are aware of the types of things that get them more podcast downloads. They're aware of the types of things that get them more Instagram likes. They're aware of the types of things that get them more saves on their Instagram posts. And it's these very specific things that are somewhat tactical rather than strategic, and that they also have some sort of complicated sounding explanation that's slightly counterintuitive, right? So that's why you see all this stuff where it's like, oh, here's this new hip warm up. People tell you that your glute med isn't firing, but here's what you actually need to do to get it going, right? It's like this specific technical sounding explanation of something that may or may not have anything to do with what's actually going on, but it sounds right to people. And they're like, yeah, this is the complicated thing that I need to do to take myself to the next level, right? What do I need? What am I missing? What little secret am I missing that's going to be the best practice, the established expert routine that if I implement it, I will move to the next level? People like that. They don't like the sort of like, who knows if this is going to work? It's all messy. We're dealing with this complicated, complex interplay between your genes, your environment, your diet, your training, how much sleep you got, all this stuff that we just can't properly account for. And we're just going to try to create scenarios in which you can potentially learn and improve over time. That's less appealing as a sales pitch. And so similarly, I was recently listening to a podcast from Hybrid, which friend Steffi Cohen runs that company. They recently started working with Matt Fraser on his delivery of CrossFit programming, right? Fraser, 5-time CrossFit Games champ, was super secretive about what he was doing in his training, didn't do all the YouTube videos and putting his programming out there and all that while he was actually competing, because he was like, hey, I'm keeping my cards close to the chest. I don't want people to know what I'm doing. But now he's in a scenario where he retired from competing and he's like, great, I learned something being the best in the world at this for 5 years. What can I now put out there for people that will actually be helpful for them, right? And I think that's super admirable for him to be like, yeah, I wasn't interested in that before. Now I have nothing to hide. I have the bandwidth to focus on it. I want to share my knowledge. So personally, I'm excited to see what he puts out there, because there's often nuggets that you can pick up from that. But one of the things that he mentioned on a recent podcast that he did with Ian and Hayden from Hybrid was that he actually was getting a lot of messages from people who were frustrated that the programming wasn't the exact programming that he was doing leading into, his CrossFit Games championships, which is pretty funny to think about, because he was trying to be somewhat clear in the communication surrounding the marketing of the programming. Like, hey, listen, this is meant to be something that people can get done in about 90 minutes in the gym. It's for people who are pretty good at this sport and are trying to improve at it, but this is not my games programming, right? This is, there's not people who can actually do that other than me and Tia leading into those championships. And even if there were people who could do it, it's maybe not what they should be doing, especially given their own strengths and weaknesses. But for Matt, he puts that out there and he gets a bunch of people who are like, why isn't this the exact training that you were doing leading into the CrossFit Games? They're frustrated with it because they think that there's some secret routine that he had that was his expert, like, oh, this exact thing has to be done at this exact time. You have to row these intervals on Tuesday, and you have to ski these intervals on Wednesday, and you have to do this many pull-ups on Friday, and your squat percentages are exactly this. If you just follow this to the T, you're going to get the same results that I got, right? And that's just not the case. And I do think that it's something that people want because they see the prestige, but they think that that's how he got that, right? But the reality is that, like, Matt had something special that he needed to do specifically for him, independent of the exact things that he followed in his training program. He was probably going to get totally different results than anyone else, which anyone who's running a sort of group program has seen. And he's just a freak, right? Like, this guy has the ability to handle and adapt to training that other people would simply get eviscerated by. So, he's trying to put his information out there in a way that's accessible for other people, and they're mad that they're not getting the exact thing that they want. And then this is another thing that's a little bit frustrating about the desire for, like, oh, here's the routine that you follow in these kinds of fitness scenarios, is that people want to do Matt Fraser's CrossFit Games training leading into his 5th World Championship, but they don't want to do what Matt Fraser did when he was at their stage of fitness to build to the point that they can even handle something resembling the training that he was doing as a full-time athlete who had been a full-time athlete for years, who is the literal best in the world in the sport, right? So it's like, it's a total disconnect as to what that progression even looks like to get to that stage, as well as what they're going to get from doing the exact thing that he was doing. So to summarize, right, when we're dealing with most things that people care about that aren't just like how to manufacture this exact car, how to design this kind of engine, we're dealing with real life phenomena that have all all these messy characteristics that are difficult to account for, that have unintended consequences when you intervene, that the actual results are somewhat decoupled from the quality of the intervention. And people don't like thinking about stuff that way. They like thinking about things as a step-by-step plan that they can follow. Again, I think I used this analogy on a recent Legion podcast, but people think of themselves as like a video game character, or if they just accumulate enough experience doing a specific task, that they will then move to the next level. It's this linear progression of like, okay, I have to kill this many enemies, I will get experience points. 1 out of every 10 enemies will drop this specific sword that I want, which will then enable me to inflict more damage with every hit. But it just doesn't work that way. It's complicated, it's complex, it's messy, it's counterintuitive, and you often have unintended consequences with your interventions. And so the best folks out there in terms of coaching, in terms of working with athletes, in terms of communicating, frame things in these ways with a lot of uncertainty and just like, hey, listen, we're going to try this. We're going to see the results that we get. We're going to tweak things. And over time, I as a coach will learn, you as an athlete will learn, we'll get better at kind of navigating this. And hopefully we can accumulate enough wins along the way that we're starting to progress, right? That's a much better way to think about this kind of progression. But unfortunately, that's not as good of a way to actually promote what you're doing, because the idea of like proven system, step 1, 2, 3, X, Y, Z, hit all these checkpoints along the way, that resonates with how people already think about things. So they're more likely to buy stuff that actually has that kind of messaging. They're more likely to engage with stuff posted on social media, posted on podcasts that has that kind of messaging. So folks who are trying to do things the right way have a little bit of an uphill battle here. But I do think that there's hopefully at least some of the people listening to this, some of the people potentially subscribe to the newsletter, that folks do understand that it doesn't always work that way. And hopefully this is a useful framework for thinking about that.